The carriage stopped at 2:15, and Miriam Beckett did not look at her husband when the door opened. She looked at the house. It was large. That was the first thing she registered, the sheer scale of it against the gray November sky. A federal-style manor in western Massachusetts, 3 stories of pale limestone with dark shutters, and a portico that had lost 2 of its columns at some point and never had them replaced. The front garden had gone to seed. The boxwood hedges along the entrance walk had grown wild and shapeless, and dead leaves had drifted against the front steps in a thick, undisturbed pile that told her plainly no one had swept them recently. Maybe not this year. She climbed out of the carriage without assistance. Behind her, she heard the sound of her husband directing the driver about the luggage, where to stack it, what to bring immediately, what could wait, and then the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel as he walked, not toward the house, but toward the stable at the far end of the property. He did not say goodbye. He did not say anything at all. Miriam stood on the front steps and watched him go. She had been Mrs. Whitmore for 6 hours. The arrangement had been her father's idea, though he had not called it that. He had called it a match, and then a fortunate circumstance, and finally, when she had pressed him, a necessity. The Beckett finances had not been discussed openly in their household since Miriam was 17. But she was not 17 anymore. And she had eyes, and she had learned to read ledgers the way some women learn to play piano. Not for pleasure, but because someone had to. Her father needed $3,000 within 90 days. Preston Whitmore needed a wife who was not connected to any of the social circles in Boston that had turned against him since the death of his first wife, Annabelle, 2 years prior. Miriam did not know the full story about Annabelle, only that she had been beautiful, that she had died in childbirth along with the infant, and that Preston had not set foot in the city since the funeral. What they had told Miriam about the estate was that it was well managed and profitable. What they had not told her, what she discovered in the first week, was that this was no longer true. The housekeeper's name was Mrs. Crane. She was a small woman in her 60s with a face like dried clay and a manner that Miriam could only describe as braced. As if she had been waiting for something unpleasant to happen, and had simply decided to remain upright until it did. The staff, Miriam said, standing in the kitchen on her second morning. How many? Presently. Myself, 2 maids, Bertie and June, a stable hand named Walt, and the groundsman, Mr. Alt. Miriam set down her teacup. For a property this size. Mrs. Crane's expression did not change. The wages haven't been paid in 4 months, Mrs. Whitmore. Most left in September. Miriam looked at the kitchen, at the blackened range that needed blacking, at the windows that hadn't been washed since summer, at the bare shelves where preserves should have been stored by now. She thought of the drive up through the property, the unmowed fields, the kitchen garden so overgrown she'd mistaken it for wild land. Who manages the estate accounts? A firm in Springfield, Hargrove and Fitch. Mr. Whitmore engaged them after the family moved away. They collect the tenant rents and the mill income and handle disbursements. When did you last see an accounting? Mrs. Crane was quiet for a moment. I have not seen one, ma'am. Miriam nodded slowly. Can you show me where the correspondence is kept? She found the ledgers in the study, which had been closed up so long that the curtains had sun-faded in their folds from where the window seams let in light. 3 years of accounts from Hargrove and Fitch, delivered quarterly, and, as far as she could tell, unread. She spread them out on the desk. There was no other word for what she did, really, and she began. She was still at the desk at 10 o'clock that night when Mrs. Crane knocked and left a tray without comment. She had been raised to this, though no one had framed it that way. Her father, before the financial troubles, had kept his own books and found her sometimes sitting with them at the kitchen table as a child. Not because anyone asked her to, but because the numbers had a kind of order that she found settling. He had taught her the basic principles of accounting not as a formal lesson, but in the way a man shows a child how to do something he loves, passing it across the table without thinking too much about whether it was appropriate. She had turned that into something more, quietly. She had kept the Beckett household accounts for 3 years. She knew what a management fee should look like. The fees Hargrove and Fitch were charging did not look right. Not wrong in the way that might be a mistake. Wrong in the way that required intention. She wrote to Preston in the 3rd week, a single page, careful and specific. She listed the discrepancies she'd found. The management fees that had increased each quarter without any documented authorization. The tenant rental income that appeared to have been underreported for at least 2 years. The mill repair costs that were listed twice in different columns as if someone hoped the duplication would be missed. She did not accuse anyone in the letter. She simply stated what the numbers showed and asked whether he wanted her to continue the review, or whether he preferred she forward everything to a solicitor. She sealed it and sent it and went back to the accounts. He did not reply. She continued the review. In the meantime, there was the house itself. Miriam was not, by nature, someone who found it easy to sit still in a problem. It was perhaps the one quality her mother had never approved of and her father had quietly relied upon. She could not fix the accounts from inside her head. She needed paper, numbers, time. But she could fix other things. She found Bertie and June in the upstairs linen room on a Thursday morning and asked them what they needed. Not what the house needed, what they needed. The distinction seemed to confuse them briefly. "We haven't had coal for the upstairs bedrooms in 6 weeks," Bertie said finally. "We've been managing with the kitchen range." Miriam went to the account she'd established at the merchant in town. She had done this quietly, noting that her name was on the marriage certificate, and therefore on the property deed, and she arranged for coal delivery. She arranged for flour, salt pork, preserves, dried beans, a wheel of cheddar that June received with an expression Miriam thought might be the closest thing to joy she'd seen in the house since arriving. She also arranged for 2 additional temporary workers from the village to begin clearing the kitchen garden before the ground froze solid. She did not ask permission for any of this. She charged it to the estate and noted every expenditure in a column she labeled, neatly, Household Restoration. The house began, incrementally, to breathe. Preston came in December. She heard the carriage from the upstairs window and watched him cross the yard below, without looking up. He was taller than she remembered. It had been cold at the wedding, and she had been looking at her gloves more than at him. He moved like a man conserving himself, as if the ordinary gestures of life had become things to be rationed. He was in the study by the time she came downstairs. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He was standing at the window with his back to her, looking at the garden she'd had cleared. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I'm glad you came." He turned. He looked at her for a moment in a way she found difficult to categorize. It was not hostility, exactly, and not warmth. It was more like a man trying to remember what he'd agreed to. "You've been busy. The kitchen garden was unusable. I had it cleared before the frost. I meant the accounts." She folded her hands in front of her. "Then yes, I have been. You found discrepancies. I found evidence of systematic fraud, Mr. Whitmore. The management fees, the underreported rents, the duplicated repair costs. It isn't accidental error. Someone made choices. I have the figures if you want to see them." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Mr. clang the gravel with the wheelbarrow he used for the cleared garden waste. The sound of ordinary work. "How long has this been going on?" Preston said. "Based on the pattern in the ledgers, I believe it started approximately 18 months after Hargrove and Fitch took over the account management. So, roughly 2 years. And how much?" She told him the number. He sat down in the chair behind the desk. She had not seen him sit before. He had always been moving or standing or leaving. The sitting changed something in his proportion. He looked, briefly, like someone who was retired. "I need to ask you something," Miriam said. Did you authorize an increase in the management fee in March of last year?" "No." "Did you authorize any changes to the fee structure at all, since you engaged them?" "No. I told them to run it and send the reports." "I didn't. I wasn't reading the reports." She had suspected as much. She did not say so. "Then we need to engage a solicitor, and we need to do it before they realize I've been through the accounts. The longer we wait, the more time they have to destroy documentation on their end." He looked at her. There was something shifting in his expression, but she couldn't name it yet. "You've already drafted the case," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've organized the documentation. The case itself would be for a solicitor to draft. I can be available to explain the figures in detail if that would be useful." Preston was quiet. Then, "How long have you been doing this?" "Since my 3rd day here." He looked at the window again. The garden. She wondered what he saw when he looked at it. Whether he saw the work or whether he saw what it had been before. "You should have written to me sooner," he said. "I did write to you." He was quiet again. "I didn't read it." "I know." The solicitor's name was Mr. Faraday. He came from Springfield, and he was a serious man with steel-rimmed glasses, and the manner of someone who rarely encountered organized documentation and had learned to be grateful for it when he did. He spread Miriam's files across the dining room table and worked through them for 4 hours with the kind of focused silence that she found, honestly, easier to sit with than most conversation. "This is thorough," he said finally. "Thank you. This is more thorough than most clients present." He looked at her over his glasses. "You did this yourself?" "I did." He looked at Preston. Preston looked at Miriam. "I did," she said again. to forestall whatever Preston was going to say. My father kept his own books. I learned from him. Mr. Faraday removed his glasses and cleaned them and replaced them. The duplication of the mill repair costs alone is sufficient to pursue a claim. The pattern across 2 years is, well, if they contest it, they will have difficulty. You have preserved everything in sequence? Quarterly, yes. Cross-referenced against the bank statements where I could obtain them. He nodded once, slowly, as if filing this information away for later reference. Very well, I'll draft the claim. He left just before 5, and Miriam and Preston were alone in the house for the first time since he'd arrived, and the silence between them was different from the silence of his first arrival in November. It wasn't indifferent, it was something else. You're going to want to eat, Miriam said, practically. Mrs. Crane has a roast on. I'll have her set the table. Yes, he said. And then, thank you. She almost said you're welcome and stopped, because she wasn't sure what he was thanking her for exactly. The food, the accounts, the 6 weeks she'd spent alone in a cold house working through someone else's fraud, and she thought the correct response was probably not to make him specify. Of course, she said, and went to find Mrs. Crane. He stayed through Christmas. She had not expected this. She had not planned for it in any practical sense. She had made no particular preparations for Christmas beyond the basic ones she'd have made anyway. The purchase of candles and greenery from the village market, a small order of dried fruit for the kitchen. She had assumed she would be alone. He was not easy company, at first. He moved through the house like a man not quite sure he was permitted in it, which she found, privately, both heartbreaking and absurd, since it was, technically, his house. He would appear in doorways, and then withdraw. He read in the library with the door ajar, and she could see his shoulder when she passed in the hall. He ate dinner without much conversation, and then sat by the fire in the parlor for an hour in the evenings, and she sat on the other side of the fireplace with her own book or her mending, and they did not speak very much, but they occupied the same room, and she thought that was its own kind of language. One evening in the 3rd week of December, she was working at the small writing desk in the parlor. A letter to Mr. Faraday about a piece of correspondence she'd received from Hargrove and Fitch, which had the flavor of intimidation, without quite being explicit about it. And she felt Preston watching her. She finished her sentence and looked up. He was across the room with his book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the guarded flatness of the early weeks, but something that went longer, deeper, the kind of look a person gives when they've stopped monitoring themselves. What is it? She said. Nothing. He looked down at his book. You just work in the evenings. I work when there's work to be done. He was quiet. Annabelle didn't. She set down her pen. It was the first time he had said the name to her directly. She had heard it from Mrs. Crane, in fragments and context, but not from him. I know very little about her, Miriam said carefully. He stopped. She was not interested in the estate or the accounts. She was interested in society, in Boston. That was where she wanted to be. He paused. That was where I took her from when we married. Miriam waited. She was unhappy here, he said. She never said so directly, but I knew, and then he stopped again. You don't have to explain, Miriam said. I know. He looked at the fire. I thought you should know that I'm aware this is not what you were promised. The house, the arrangement. It was supposed to be a managed property with income and a staff, and I gave you a house that needed work, Miriam said. He looked at her. It needed work, she repeated, simply. And I found work to do. That's all, Mr. Whitmore. You don't owe me an apology for the state of the house. I owe you something, he said quietly. She picked up her pen. Then stay through the new year, she said, and went back to her letter. He did. In January, Hargrove and Fitch attempted to preempt the legal claim by dissolving the partnership and reassigning the estate management contract to a new entity under a different name. A transparent maneuver that Mr. Faraday identified within 48 hours, and that Miriam recognized instantly when she reviewed the correspondence, because the new firm's contact address was the same building on Main Street in Springfield. She wrote to Mr. Faraday the same afternoon. She noted the address discrepancy. She noted that 3 of the client references listed by the new firm corresponded to properties she'd identified in the ledgers as having their rental income redirected through an intermediary account. She laid it out neatly, in the order a solicitor would want, and she sent it by courier. Preston was in the stable when she finished. She went to tell him what she'd found. He was checking the left foreleg of one of the horses, crouched in the straw with a calm, methodical patience she recognized as the same patience she'd seen in him at the dinner table, in the parlor, in the way he'd so slowly it was almost invisible, started to take up space in the house again. He looked up when she came in. She told him about the new firm, the address match, the redirected rental accounts. He straightened. He was quiet for a moment, listening to her, and then he said, "How do you do that?" Do what?" "Keep it all in your head." "The accounts, the correspondence, the connections between them." She considered this. "I suppose it's like a garden," she said. "Each thing connects to another thing underneath. You just have to be willing to dig." He looked at her for a long moment. The horse shifted beside him. The light in the stable was low and dusty and warm from the bodies of the animals. "I'll write to Faraday myself," he said. "He should know I'm fully engaged with this." "He already knows," Miriam said, "but it will help for him to hear it from you directly." Preston nodded, and then, because she was already turning to go, he said, "Miriam." It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned. "The kitchen garden," he said. "The one you had cleared in November. There's a section on the south end that used to have. My grandmother had strawberries there." "I don't suppose I can plant them in the spring," she said. "If you tell me where she kept them." "I know where," he said. "Then we'll plant them together," she said, and went back to the house. The legal resolution came in March. Hargrove and Fitch, the original partners, a man named Hargrove who was 58 and had managed to project respectability for 30 years, and a younger man named Fitch who had joined the firm 8 years prior, and who, Mr. Faraday believed, had introduced the fraudulent practices, settled rather than allow the claim to go to court. The settlement figure was substantial. Not everything that had been taken, but enough to cover 2 full years of legitimate estate management, and then some, enough to pay the outstanding wages, enough to hire proper staff. Miriam accepted the settlement terms, with the same even expression with which she had reviewed the first suspicious ledger page in November. Not triumphant, not relieved, exactly, just finished. Preston was in the room when she signed the final papers at Mr. Faraday's office. He signed where he needed to sign. Afterward, on the street outside, the March wind coming cold off the river, he looked at her and said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You've already said that," she said. "I know. I keep saying it because I haven't found the right version yet." She pulled her coat closer. Up the street, a market was setting up its stalls for the day. Early spring vegetables, the thin-looking goods of late winter, a woman selling eggs from a basket. An ordinary morning. "You don't have to find a version," she said. "You could just come home instead." He was quiet for a moment. The word hung there between them. Home, in a way that she hadn't quite anticipated when she said it, simple and weighted at once. "Is it?" he said. Still, she looked at him. "Yes," she said, "if you want it to be." He came home in April. The strawberries they planted on the south end of the kitchen garden were the old-fashioned kind, the variety his grandmother had kept, that spread low and slow and took all summer to really establish themselves. He knew where the original crowns had been stored. In paper-wrap bundles in the cool of the root cellar, a fact that surprised her when she found them there. As if some part of the house had been waiting. They planted on a Tuesday morning, the two of them in the dirt together. Miriam in her oldest dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Preston crouching beside her with the kind of careful patience she'd come to recognize as one of the actual things about him. Not a performance, just who he was. Mrs. Crane brought out coffee at 10 o'clock and set it on the garden wall without comment and withdrew, and Miriam saw the woman almost smile as she went. "She likes you," Preston said. "She likes that the wages are being paid." "That too," he agreed, "but also you." Miriam sat back on her heels and looked at the row they'd planted, neat and even, the crowns in the dark soil already, somehow, looking like the beginning of something. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why did you agree to the marriage?" She had wondered this since November. She had turned it over in the long evenings in the study, the quiet dinners, the evenings by the fire. It was the one thing she hadn't been able to account for, the one number that didn't add up cleanly. He was quiet for a moment. "My solicitor at the time told me I needed someone responsible," he said. "Someone who wouldn't expect the life that Annabelle had wanted. Someone who would be practical." He paused. "Your father said you kept the household accounts. That's why you chose me. That's why I listened." "But," he stopped, "your father also said you were the kind of person who didn't stop." She looked at him. "At things," he said, "that when you started something you didn't stop." He said it like a warning, actually. Like he was being honest with me about a difficulty. She almost laughed. "That sounds like him. I thought it sounded like exactly what I needed." He looked at the garden. "I just didn't realize what that would mean, in practice." What did it mean, in practice? He turned and looked at her directly. It was the same look she'd seen in the parlor in December, the one she still didn't have a name for. Only now it was full daylight, and there was nowhere for it to go except toward her. It meant I came back, he said. The April light was warm on the turned earth. Somewhere in the orchard beyond the garden wall a bird was going about its business loudly and without apology, the way birds do in spring when they've decided to assert themselves. Miriam picked up her coffee cup from the wall and looked at the row of strawberry crowns and thought about all the months November and now. The ledgers, the cold house, Mrs. Crane's braced expression, the cold delivery that had felt like a small declaration, the evenings by the fire that had slowly, so slowly, begun to feel like something other than endurance. She thought about the number that had finally added up. Good, she said. We have a garden to finish.